Hello everybody and welcome to this video. This is Mr. Johnson Teaches Tissue. So you will find this one in your GCSE English Literature exam. It's part of paper 2, and within paper 2 this is where the exam board will print a question and will also print a copy of one of the poems alongside that question, and then it's up to you to make a choice and decide which other poem best answers that question and will compare to the poem that they have given you. So it may well be that you choose tissue, it may well be that they print tissue. Either way, it's a good one to know. It's a particularly one maybe if you're trying to push yourself with poetry and you might have a certain confidence with poetry. Sometimes people feel that tissue is a really hard poem, and I'd like to think during the course of this video you will see it isn't a really hard poem. It's just got some very deep and clever ideas alongside it. Either way, you'll be needing to pause this video as we go through it, watching it, and making sure you're adding notes either to your copy of the poem or certainly writing notes down somewhere. It's always really important that revision is active, so make sure you are actively revising as we move through into this video. So beforehand, make sure you've got a copy of the poem in front of you. That's going to be really important. You may need to copy one off the internet, print one off perhaps. If you search for darker tissue poem, you'll find it fairly quickly. The other thing you can do is go on BBC Bite Size. So if you were to search for BBC Bite Size, you could throw the word GCSE in there as well, but also tissue and poem, you will find that the BBC have done a fantastic set of pages helping you revise this poem, and it includes a reading of the poem as well. And I'm pretty confident actually it's by Imtiaz Darka herself. So, before we go any further with this one, the thing that I want you to remember about this poem all the way through is it's a massive extended metaphor. She is talking a lot about paper and about other things and structures all made from paper, and the reason for that is our lives can be compared to paper. So if you hold in your head that this is actually a poem about life and about being born and living life and then dying, and then she compares it to lots of other things, then you will find your understanding of this poem much stronger. It's not one to be scared of by any means. And what I've just described to you there, by using paper all the way through to represent our lives, it's not just a metaphor once. That is why it is an extended metaphor that runs right through the poem. So, you definitely want to pause this video right now and just read the poem through to yourself once. Just refamiliarise yourself with it and remind yourself what's going on inside that. So I'm going to pause for a few seconds to allow you to pause this video and read the poem. Okay, and I'm presuming that that is what you've done. Hopefully so. As I said, there's a reading on BBC Bite Size as well, which is very good. So let's talk about Imtiaz Darka then. So, really good poet Imtiaz Darka is, certainly. She was born in Pakistan, but in 1954, she was born in 1954, but she then grew up in Scotland. So although being born in a different country, she actually grew up in this country. However, as you might imagine, those are very different cultures, Scotland and Pakistan, and her poetry really reflects that mixed identity and the idea of what it is, identity, and what identity actually is. She's also a famous filmmaker as well as being a poet. Her poetry really does focus on identity, as I just mentioned. Also women's roles and like searching for meaning amongst many things. Her poetry, I really like her poetry. I learnt her poetry when I was back at school, and that's why I put that final bullet point. She's been part of these poetry anthologies that have been studied for GCSE. It's been nearly 20 years. So, I mean, that tells you something about the quality of her writing. If you fancy it, I really would recommend looking up some of her other poetry. Blessing is a very good one, and I did that as an unseen poem on my channel as well. So moving on then, just a little bit of context for you. I'm not going to read all of this word for word, so you might want to pause it. Very different sort of context, because unlike any history behind this poem, it's much more about sort of the world and a reflection of the world and sort of issues in our world as well. And what's important in life really is the sort of context of this poem, which I've sort of touched on earlier in the video really. About life being fragile is something I definitely want to hang on to in my head. And like the idea of tissue being something which is very fragile as well. Hence the title, which is what I was going to talk about here. So think about the title, tissue. Your probably first thought is more about the picture on the right, which is sort of tissue paper, something which is very fragile, delicate, as I put there, easily broken. If you were to screw it up and unscrew it, you can't get rid of those marks. So something which is sort of very delicate, as I've said there, but also human tissue. So the fact that we are made from tissue, therefore are we also fragile, like the tissue paper is as well. So a bit of clever double meaning going on in the title. Before we actually go into each of the stanzas, have a look at the poem as a whole there, laid out on the page. This is what you would call the form, or possibly even the structure of it as well. There are regular stanzas. Always write down why they do it. Don't just write regular stanzas down. Regular stanzas, almost mirroring like the stages of life. You've got the stages of that poem neatly ordered out. A bit like your life can be broken down into stages as well. Like the bit where you're born, the bit where you first go to school and are educated, the bit where you leave school and go and get a job, the bit where you get married, the bit where you have kids. Life is divided into stages, and in many ways this poem is trying to mirror life, and therefore its form also mirrors that as well. However, although it's very regular in its structures, in its stanzas, actually it has no rhyme scheme, and there's no real regular rhythm and beat to those lines, which you get in a lot of other poems. So it's almost like trying to break free, almost trying to sort of not be held back and sort of tied up by these by structures as well, almost trying to sort of regulate and reflect that freedom. And you can see that in the enjambment as well, the lines spilling over at the end, so not always pausing at the ends of lines, but also the caesura, sort of just breaking it up and sort of putting breaks in. It almost tries to reflect Imtiaz Darkel's like want for openness and want for freedom. So now let's go through each of the stanzas. There are quite a few, so with the time I've got being limited, I'm going to go through these fairly quickly. There's a lot more you can read into this poem. It's very clever. This is one of those poems which isn't like something like maybe Remains or Poppies, where you can follow it and there's a very clear story, or Charge of the Light Brigade being another good one. This one, it sort of drifts. Imagine like a waves of coming onto the beach, going backwards and forwards. It sort of drifts backwards and forwards between ideas. Paper that lets the light shine through. This is what could alter things. Paper, thinned by age or touching. Instantly we've got that repetition, really trying to emphasise how our lives could be compared to paper. And it says on that last line there, thinned by age or touching. People's skin thins as you get older, and you can sort of see through it a little bit and see like the veins and so forth beneath. So in some ways there's a real sort of mirroring here, and that's the word I would use on your notes. It's sort of mirroring what paper is like to life in that first stanza. And light being sort of very symbolic as well, very positive as well, the ideas of light, so like very positive connotations. The kind you find in well-used books, the back of the Quran. Now the Quran being the holy text of Islam, almost makes it sort of a very serious comparison, makes it quite religious in some ways, sort of really emphasises that idea of life and God and sort of our life being controlled in some ways. Where a hand has written in the names and histories who was born to whom. So sort of almost talking about paper being used to record our lives. It's sort of, again, it's just bringing paper and bringing life together. So turning the metaphor into a strong one. The height and weight, so they're talking about writing down sort of things in the back of books here. The height and weight, who died, where and how, on which sepia date. There's a little hint of rhyme, internal rhyme going on there between weight and date, but it's just sort of fleeting and then it's gone again. Sepia is the sort of colour you see going on there, that sort of very brown colour, sort of ageing in some ways. And then listen to these sibilants going on in these lines here. Pages smoothed and stroked. So it's a very, very delicate tone in this poem, very soft. There's nothing threatening here, there's nothing angry. It's almost sort of trying to sort of just be a very calm poem, very positive in its sort of reflection on life. So it's not a critical poem, it's actually, like I say, very positive. Turned transparent with attention. Paper, if you touch it again and again and again, eventually it starts sort of becoming very delicate and very fragile, a bit like humans and human skins, like it's fragile as you get older as well. So again, there's that mirroring going on there, transparent being almost see-through. If buildings were paper, I might feel their drift. See how easily they fall away on a sigh, a shift. There's that again, a little bit of internal rhyme going on there. It just hints at it in the direction of the wind. This is where there's a slight shift, I would say, structurally in this poem. So we move from talking about books to actually talking about buildings and other structures and what they would be like if they were paper, she says there. See how easily they fall away. So actually, if they were made from paper, then actually they wouldn't be so secure. A bit like life. Again, it sort of mirrors the idea, the key word being fragile. I think this is sort of trying to mirror the idea of life being fragile. Maps too. Look at that really short sentence there to try and emphasise this as well. Now, maps are something which are much more about control and how our lives are maybe controlled, and certainly controlled by things that are written down on paper. It's much more electronic these days, perhaps. But maps too. The sun shines through. There's a bit more internal rhyme for you. They're border lines, the marks that rivers make, roads, rail tracks, mountain folds. Lots of listing going on there. Sort of building up the pace a little bit. And then we've got fine slips. Listen to the sibilants in these lines. Fine slips from grocery shops. So loads of that very delicate tone going on there that say how much was sold and what was paid by credit card. They might fly our lives like paper kites. Sort of showing us there how our lives really can be controlled by money and sort of controlled by sort of documents and paper as well. But particularly money there, which is that reference to receipts, which you can see in the photograph in the background. An architect, so these people who plan buildings, an architect could use all this, place layer over layer. That's what they do. They've got their paper and it sort of builds up their drawings one on top of each other. A bit like your life builds up as well, layer by layer, and you get more experienced. Script over numbers over line, and never wish to build again with brick or block. But but let the daylight break. So you've got brick, block, and break. Some really hard sounds going on there as well. She talks about through capitals and monoliths. So actually what you've got there is sort of something very solid and very structural, these ideas of monoliths. But also through the shapes that pride can make, find a way to trace a grand design. A grand design is something very big. So in this stanza, you've got this very grand imagery going on, sort of comparing life to these big structures that we build, but they never last. Think about Ozymandias. I'll talk about that in a minute as a good comparison. But Ozymandias is this same idea that time is more powerful because we are fragile. And then finally she says, what was the previous line? Grand design with living tissue. Raise a structure. So there's a double meaning there. Raise a structure like build something like a building, but also raise a structure like a human structure. But this is where it gets a bit dark. Never meant to last. The circle of life. We are born, we grow up, we might have children, we die, they have children. Of paper smoothed and stroked. There's that repetition of that earlier line. Again, sort of idea. If it goes round in circles, you could almost talk about the circle of life with that idea as well. And thin to be transparent. And this is where she really hammers it home, trying to make it very much obvious. Turned into your skin. So she's really telling us that she is talking about us here in this poem. Now I'm running out of time, so I'm going to flick through these final bits quickly. Lots of references to sepia, old, and certainly structures as well in this as well. So sort of structures is very strong, but things not lasting forever. There's a real theme of that in this poem, I would say, if you're looking for themes. Pause. I'm not going to be able to read through all these questions, but the questions in the green box there are designed to help you look more closely. Use them to try and write notes. They don't just ask you to find the sibilants, it asks you to label why that sibilance might be there. So you're going to need to pause that slide or come back to that slide in a minute. Comparisons with other poems? Well, I hinted a minute ago that I think this one compares really well to Ozymandias. Both are about structures. Both are about structures not living forever. They have very different tones, however. Ozymandias is a very sort of strong, commanding tyrant, whereas you've got this very soft, delicate tone here with lots of sibilants. But both of them have that idea particularly of battles against time and not lasting forever. And then this is the question I'd like you to have a little think about and have a go at yourself. You'd be asked to make a comparison with another poem in the exam. However, here I'm asking you just to focus on Tissue on its own. The question I've asked you there is, how does Darker explore ideas about life? If you don't know where to begin, I've got an example on my next slide. When you do your example, don't just copy mine. At the bottom of that box there, I've talked about you. Talk about the sibilants. Look at the sibilants and write about the sibilants and how it creates a gentle tone whilst there's a serious message about life being very fragile, which is sort of quite hard. So you've got soft words, hard message. And finally, an example PEAR paragraph for you, which is colour coded. Use those sentence starters, and if you use all those sentence starters and then keep doing that when you do your own writing in exams, you will pick up more marks. Why? Because in my first line there, I actually directly answer the question and talk about like the message of the poem, linking it to the question. My next sentence in blue, I pick out a method that's used, which is always really important. I've embedded a quote in green. In my red, I've analysed some of the words really closely, and I've also tried to offer a second idea as well. Take my idea further. That gets me more marks. That's where I've written additionally. So look at that yourself, pause it and have a read. But that's where I'm analysing things closely and talking about connotations. With the final bit in purple, again, use my sentence starters. That's me talking about the poet's message and trying to say what we are taught by this poem. that's me out of time. I wish you the very best of luck when it comes to you doing these exams. I hope that this video has been useful, and check out some of my others. Bye bye.